So welcome again to another Authors at Google program here in New York. We're really excited. We have Ginger Strand here with us today. She grew up in Texas, Missouri, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan simultaneously. That's very difficult. I'm excited to hear how that happened. Her fiction and essays have appeared in many places, including Harper's, The Believer, the Iowa Review, the Gettysburg Review, Raritan, and Orion, where she's a contributing editor. A former fellow in the Behrman Center for Humanities at Princeton, she has received residency grants from the MacDowell Colony, Yaddo, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the American Antiquarian Society. Ooh, very cool. She is a local here in New York City, and today she'll be talking about Inventing Niagara, this awesome book that you guys should all have. This book basically combines history, reportage, personal narrative, and traces Niagara's journey from the sublime icon to engineering marvel to camp spectacle. It's an awesome book. I've just recently started it, and I'm definitely sharing all my fun facts about Niagara with all my friends, as you will as well. But I am not the expert. I will turn it over to Ginger Strand. Please help us welcome her.
Thanks. For the executives in the room, they turn it off and on. So you're free to go. That's the sort of summary of what I'm going to read today. I thought I would read from the most kind of techie chapter in the book, which is called King of Power, Queen of Beauty, which is a nickname for Niagara Falls. And this is about the power development at the falls and some of my thoughts about it. So I will just dive right in. And I have slides to accompany it because I just think that's more fun. In the spring of 2006, I go see Niagara Falls get turned on for the tourist season. I drive for 7 hours and get there a day early on March 31st. I head straight for the Three Sisters to get close to the river. I want to see what it looks like before they crank it up. The best thing, in New York's Niagara Falls State Park, the Three Sisters form a mini archipelago off the side of Goat Island. Sitting in the rapids above the Horseshoe Fall, the three little islands are linked by picturesque stone bridges. And I put an arrow in so you could see where they were here in this Army Corps photo. I stop on the bridge to the First Sister and look upstream at the Hermit's Cascade, a river ledge depicted on the island's interpretive marker as a surging mini Niagara. Today, it's a few freshets splashing over a flaky slice of rock. And there it is today. That's the same spot as the previous slide. Things perk up on the Second Sister, and by the third, the river's in a frenzy. Even at low water, the Third Sister feels like what it is, a rocky outcropping in the middle of some of the world's roughest rapids. Water rushes and swirls furiously around its edges. It's loud. Just downstream, the river surges over the Horseshoe Fall and disappears. A misty abyss marks the spot. I'm not alone. A middle-aged couple, sneakered and stout, pick their way along the path. They regard the rapids with the dull resignation of people beaten into subjection by miles of throughway. Dutifully, they take turns posing for snapshots before the man approaches me. "Do you know where the really big waterfall is?" he asks. "See that mist over there?" I say, pointing. His face falls. "The Horseshoe Fall? We saw that." His eyes go to the Canadian skyline. "I thought there was a bigger waterfall." "Come back tomorrow," I say. Of course, it's an exaggeration to say that Niagara Falls is turned off and on for the tourists. It's actually turned up for the tourists. In the Niagara Diversion Treaty of 1950, the US and Canada agreed to go halvesies on one of the world's largest natural sources of hydroelectric power. They promised never to let fewer than 50,000 cubic feet of water per second go over the falls, and they double that minimum to 100,000 cubic feet per second, about half the natural volume, between 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. April 1st to September 15th. That's so that the 20 million or so tourists who flock to Niagara annually, most in the summer, don't all walk away wondering where the big fall went. But that's unlikely. The man I meet on the Third Sister is unusual. Most people are surprised to learn that half to three-quarters of Niagara's water never goes over the falls. Water diversions for hydropower are enormous, but their effect on the scenery is limited by massive engineering projects that keep everything looking the same. Even as most of the Niagara River is drawn off into 4 hydro tunnels in one canal, The waterfall spreads across basically the same crest line, looks the same depth, and shimmers with the same emerald green. The end result is an environment that elides any conflict between landscape enjoyment and resource expenditure. You see, it cheerfully declares, we can have our lake and use it too. I imagine the spring increase of water as a kind of local festival. They're turning the falls back up. I call the New York Power Authority with visions of electro geeks dialing up the water and watching it rip in a celebratory mood. I found this picture online that represents sort of what I thought it might look like. Maybe champagne would be involved, or pizza, donuts at the very least. On the phone, however, Joanne Wilmot, Regional Manager for Community Relations, assures me there's little fanfare around treaty implementation. What if I buy the pizza, I ask. Joanne and I have arranged to meet at the Robert Moses Niagara Power Plant, a monster dam built into the face of the Niagara Gorge 4.5 miles downstream from the falls. The Moses plant produces at top capacity 2.4 million kilowatts of nonstop electricity, 2.4 gigawatts. The Power Vista, the authority's visitor center, is a huge sunny room suspended over the river at one end of the looming plant. Kids scramble around its maze of displays while their parents try to explain electrons. There's an outside deck, and when you go out onto it, the deep, low whir of turbines fills your ears. The air seems to buzz with voltage. Huge flocks of gulls wheel and scream over the churning water at the dam's base, where fish, alive, dead, or stunned from their trip through the turbines, are pushed to the surface on outgoing currents. Across the river, the Canadian dam hulks like an opposing giant. It's impossible not to be awed. Joanne has the friendly but cautious disposition of a public relations person. She seems especially eager to relieve me of my handbag. She deposits it somewhere mysterious in the back offices, then walks me to the Power Vista's centerpiece, a vast, miniature replica of the region, highlighting the authority's intakes, tunnels, generating stations, and reservoir. The falls in one corner are represented by an inch-high clear plastic mold. Tiny white lights behind the plastic are meant to produce the illusion of frothy water. At the side of the miniature landscape, Joanne introduces me to Norm Stessing, Supervisor of Operations, the man, in my mind, who can dial up Niagara's deluge. He doesn't look like a power king. He looks like a Norm. He's medium height, stocky, but trim and tanned, with even teeth and a quick, easy smile. His crisp shirt is tucked in perfectly. Norm dives into explaining how his power plant works with the vigor of a high school physics teacher who really believes in those kids. Our generator capacity is 100,000 cubic feet per second, he tells me, explaining the treaty implementation that starts tomorrow. But during the day, our stream share is about 50,000. Before I know it, we've launched into a heady conversation about turbine efficiency, pump storage, voltage step-ups, and price differentials. Luckily, I've read enough to have a basic understanding because Norm, pointing to the model switchyard and explaining how voltage gets there through a mile of underground tunnels, is like a 12-year-old boy who's been given a really, really cool toy. When Westinghouse and Tesla wired Niagara to Buffalo with alternating current in 1895, skeptics were convinced it would fail. The switch was thrown in Buffalo in the dead of night in order to avoid public humiliation. To almost everyone's surprise, it worked. After that breakthrough, the electrification of America happened quickly. In 1910, 10% of American homes were wired for electricity. By 1930, 70% were. It's easy to forget how radical a change electrification was, but if there's a main difference between our lives and those lived in Edith Wharton novels, it has less to do with carriages and corsets than it does with turbines and megawatts. Electrification automated industry, de-skilled labor, industrialized agriculture, depopulated rural areas, invented suburbs, and enabled a non-literate mass media. Our fabulous modern lifestyle, Chicken McNuggets to America's top model, all began with electricity. The change was more than infrastructure. It was a nationwide behavioral modification, and it required re-education. Americans had to be trained to stop fearing electricity and instead consume it, preferably, at least to the companies who generated and sold kilowatts in large quantities. Major players, General Electric and Westinghouse, quickly decided to manufacture demand by inventing a lot of nifty electric appliances, irons, refrigerators, toasters. Just about anything done by hand or with gas, it turned out, could be made electric and sold to consumers as easier. But first they had to get average Americans to adopt what they called the wedge product, electric light, because it opened households to everything else. They had to sell the idea of electricity, and in this, Niagara was key. The falls helped electricity get what marketing consultants today call mind share. Average folks had only a vague notion of what electricity was, but they knew it was deadly. Thomas Edison had proven that. In the 1880s, striving to promote direct current over Tesla's competing technology, Edison had famously staged roadshows meant to discredit alternating current by using it to electrocute dogs. This can't have made people eager to wire up their homes, especially those with pets. Nor did it help that New York State quickly saw a great new use for high voltage, switching the murder penalty from hanging to electrocution in 1888. Electricity really needed a spokesmodel, and with Niagara's power push, the PR campaign had its mascot. In the 1890s, as the falls were being harnessed, a flood of articles about Niagara power hit newsstands. Harper's, Nature, Collier's, McClure's, Blackwood's, Cassier's, all printed articles describing falls power projects and promoting the image of Niagara as unending bounty. Popular Science Monthly was typical. People in general have the idea that Niagara water power is inexhaustible, they said, and so it probably is, so far as human requirements go. Niagara, promoters declared, would even free us from dirty coal, already understood to be non-renewable. Compared with coal, hydroelectric turbines were cleaner, safer, and easier to understand, Constable water wheels writ large. A Buffalo real estate booklet bragged that Niagara created limitless power without consuming an atom of the world's store of fuel, without destroying in the slightest degree the grandeur of the cataract. Go ahead and buy that toaster, the message ran. We've discovered a source of endless clean energy. Or in this case, typewriter. And you see a lot of these ads from this period. It's some sort of electric appliance with Niagara in the background. Brown Niagara launched for real at the 1901 World's Fair, the Pan American Exposition at Buffalo. The theme was better living through electrification. Visitors were ushered into an electric utopia featuring electric trolleys, rides, fountains, and appliances, a working miniature power plant, and row upon row of electric incubators holding live premature babies, all of it lit by 200,000 incandescent bulbs. At the center, and this is what you're seeing in this very early film made by Thomas Edison, was the electric tower, a skyscraper featuring a 74-foot artificial waterfall lit by 94 searchlights. On top of the tower was another searchlight trained on the real Niagara Falls. Lord Kelvin was quoted in the Literary Digest gleefully predicting the day when men would turn Niagara off and on at will. Here's what happens. Gravity constantly draws water into hydraulic tunnel intakes located in the river above the falls. In the tunnels, and that would be here, this is the falls right here. In the tunnels, the water travels underneath the city of Niagara Falls, paralleling the river's course for 4.5 miles. But the river drops not only in the 176-foot falls, but in the rapids above and below them. By the time the diverted water reaches the power plant's holding pool, or forebay, it is about 300 feet above the lower river. The higher head means the water spins the turbines with more pressure, generating more power than it would at the brink of the falls. The process is duplicated on the Canadian side. Not a great slide, but this is the American power plant and reservoir behind it. At the Moses plant's forebay, the water can flow down through the main penstocks where it spins the 13 turbines and passes out into the lower Niagara River, or it can be pumped 120 feet up through 12 two-way pump generator turbines into the 1,900-acre Lewiston Reservoir. The reservoir lets the Power Authority collect water at night when tourists are sleeping and stream share is greater, and then use it for generation during daytime when power demand is up. Since electricity deregulation, the reservoir also creates an opportunity to optimize financials. As prices vary throughout the day, the Lewiston plant can pump water into its reservoir during periods of low demand, then release water through the generator when demand is high. It's a perfect example of buy low, sell high. The authority spends cheap power to make expensive power. All this is regulated by the Niagara River Control Center, an arm of the International Joint Commission that manages the falls. Because rainfall, temperature, and even wind direction influence the water level in Lake Erie, and thus how much water is coming into Niagara Strait, River Control measures the river hourly. As its volume varies, they calculate the amount each nation can draw down and call the power facilities, in the U.S., the NYPA Energy Control Center in Utica, every hour to dictate their stream shares. So on April 1st, Norm explains, River Control will call Utica at 7 a.m. with a new stream share reduced by the amount required to let 100,000 cubic feet per second go over the falls by 8. Utica will call Niagara, and the workers in Norm's control room will sit down at their computers and begin turning off reservoir pumps. We had this long conversation. I had in mind like a big switch. I wanted it to be a red switch, and I wanted him to show me the switch, and he kept saying, no, it's just computers. It's not that interesting. So it doesn't sound as good. Each shutdown, this is impressive though, decreases the flow of water out of the forebay, thus decreasing the flow of water into the tunnels upstream from the river by 4,000 cubic feet per second. That's about the flow of the Colorado River. When the water coming into the forebay equals the authority's stream share, the water going over the falls should be the amount required by treaty, and the tourists should be oohing and aahing at the sublime power of nature. You couldn't really turn off all of Niagara Falls, could you? I asked Norm, my enthusiasm for the brute strength getting the best of me. If you and the Canadian plant both just sucked as much water as possible out of the river and ran it through your generators at top speed? We don't like to talk about it that way, he said, cracking an involuntary grin. But in fact, yes, we could. The earliest power plants at Niagara quickly became tourist attractions to rival the falls themselves. Designed by McKim, Mead, and White, architects of the original Penn Station, the first two powerhouses and matching transformer building on the New York side were architecturally splendid. Once open, they offered guided tours where visitors could observe the cleanliness, order, and relative quiet of the plants. This is a postcard. People sent many, many postcards of the interiors of the power plants. The production of hydroelectricity wasn't like the noisy, dirty factories of the Industrial Revolution. Far from William Blake's dark, satanic mills, this was a sparkling industry for a gleaming new age. Guidebooks declared the tour a must-see. Some visitors liked the power plant more than the waterfall. After a 1906 visit, H.G. Wells wrote, "The dynamos and turbines of the Niagara Falls Power Company impressed me far more than the Cave of the Winds." Wells was in agreement with Lord Kelvin. Niagara Falls would be better turned off. "It seems altogether well," he reported, "that all the froth and hurry of Niagara at last, all of it, dying into hungry canals of intakes, should rise again in light and power." Not everyone agreed. Toward the end of Max Sennett's 1926 silent slapstick comedy Wandering Willies, this is a Keystone Cops comedy, the bad guy drops a piece of paper. The heroine picks it up, reads it, and gasps in shock. She shows it to the hero. He too is appalled, and together they race off after the villain. What did the paper say? According to film lore, the intertitle giving the paper's content was rewritten several times. One version had the heroine crying, "He was stealing my diploma as winner of a beauty contest." Another had her saying, "This proves he's president of the Kidnappers Corporation." The final intertitle was, "Look, a mortgage on Niagara Falls. We must stop it before he shuts off the water." Film critics used this to illustrate the zany, nonsensical quality of Sennett's Keystone Cop films. But in 1926, the notion of a land-grabbing villain turning off the falls would not have read as nonsense. Controversy over water diversions raged throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, beginning almost immediately after the Niagara Reservation, America's first state park, was established in 1885. By 1889, 4 companies had been granted charters to take unlimited water from above the falls without compensating the state. The commissioners of the Niagara Reservation declared New York was pouring nature's splendor into the pockets of greedy robber barons. A public outcry ensued. In Canada, at this time, a grassroots movement had arisen demanding public takeover of the power industry. June 1906 saw the birth of the Hydroelectric Power Commission of Ontario, a publicly owned utility to manage province water resources. But in the US, where public utilities were seen as creeping communism, the fight to save Niagara turned instead to limiting the rights of private companies. Hearings were held. General Electric declared that limiting their water rights would deprive New Yorkers of jobs. They were just then undertaking a huge power and navigation project named after its originator, Love Canal. All to little avail. The public rallied to Niagara's cause, and the 1909 International Boundary Waters Treaty granted power plants on the American side 20,000 cubic feet per second, and those on the Canadian side 36,000. little more than was already being diverted. At some point in the 20th century, we convinced Canada to go halvesies with us, and I don't know when that happened. I couldn't find that fact. The outcry had made it clear that the public valued beauty. Understanding this, the power companies got right to work. Before the ink was dry on the treaty, they wanted more water, and to get it, industry spin doctors hatched a sophisticated PR campaign. If they couldn't change people's minds about the importance of scenic grandeur, they would reinterpret what that meant. And so they set out to convince the public that keeping Niagara pretty meant taking more water away. In 1918, John Lyell Harper, vice president and chief engineer of the Niagara Falls Power Company, wrote The Suicide of the Horseshoe Fall, a little book arguing that because of heavy water flow, the falls were wearing themselves away into a string of paltry rapids. In 1923, he built an operating scale model of the falls and used it to demonstrate how natural recession would inevitably ruin the cataract. The Army Corps of Engineers agreed. In 1926, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover reported that Army Corps surveys proved the falls were soon to become merely a turbulent rapids. The following year, the Buffalo, Niagara, and Eastern Power Corporation put out a pamphlet asking, "Why is the Horseshoe Fall eating itself to ruin?" The answer, according to the power company, was clear. There was too much water. Silly nature. Only bigger drawdowns could save the falls. Preservation now meant less water, exactly the opposite of what it meant 20 years earlier. Furthermore, the pamphlet declared, Niagara benefited everyone by providing the cheap, dependable power needed for the many electrochemical products which are being manufactured at or near Niagara and bestowed upon mankind. This host of goodies was also bestowing something else upon mankind, a cataract of toxic waste. The American power plant's first customer was the Pittsburgh Reduction Company, later the aluminum giant Alcoa. They were soon joined by dozens of other companies that were beginning to use electricity to catalyze chemical reactions, including carborundum, Matheson Alkali, Atchison Graphite, Hooker Electrochemical, and Union Carbide and Carbon. By 1925, this was downtown Niagara Falls. It was a leading center for the production of abrasives, graphite, and graphite derivatives, such as electrodes and anodes, dry cell batteries, and a range of ferroalloys. It was also a major producer of sodium hydroxide, a caustic used in everything from soap making to petroleum refining. Sodium hydroxide production produces vast amounts of the byproduct chlorine, so Niagara Falls became the first municipality in the nation to chlorinate its water. The region also led the way in the invention of chlorinated chemicals, pesticides, plasticizers, fire retardants, chlorinated solvents, and chlorinated organics like PCBs and Mirex, a highly toxic flame retardant and insecticide. As industry ramped up and jobs multiplied, public distaste for water diversions abated. During the Depression in particular, interest in the area's natural beauty waned. The preservationists responded by focusing more and more narrowly on the waterfall. A 1931 report of the Special International Niagara Board anatomized its aesthetic value in painstaking detail, calculating how much of its beauty depended on volume, width, height, clarity, and color, going so far as to point out that the actual volume of the waterfall was not critical to beauty, though the impression of volume was. The report estimated how much water could be removed while maintaining the emerald green, the seeming depth and velocity. Charts, graphs, and a special set of color chips were adduced. The theoretical transformation of Niagara from sublime natural wonder to engineering feat had begun. At the same time, the dark undercurrents of cheap power were beginning to make themselves known. The American riverbank was lined with ugly factories. Disposing of electrochemical byproducts was an increasing problem. And in 1935, 20 workers filed suit against Alcoa. They were dying of the lung disease silicosis. At the Power Authority, I asked Norm Stessing how much electricity an average household uses today. About 1,000 watts, he said. I asked if that number was on the rise. Norm and Joanne nodded vigorously. I remember when it was 500 watts, Joanne said. The U.S. gets about 7% of its electricity from hydropower. Most people are surprised by that because hydro is still the smiling public face of electricity. The Power Authority has visitor centers at several hydro plants. There are no visitor centers at nuclear or coal-burning plants. The largest nuclear power plants today surpass Niagara's 4.5 gigawatt rating. That's combining the American and Canadian plants. And the largest coal-fired plants are drawing near that. Yet, in the Northeast blackout of 2003, a widely circulated rumor held that the massive loss of power resulted from a lightning strike at Niagara. When he told me this, Norm bristled, as if personally offended. He did not, he declared, lose power for a single second. How much that helped was pretty clear, even in the dark. It's easy to forget, it's easy for residential consumers to forget that electricity, 70% of which in this country comes from burning fossil fuels, takes an environmental toll because we don't see the plants that make it. Our power arrives in the socket clean and odorless, and even with recent price hikes, it's still relatively cheap. We may be turning down the heat and buying hybrid cars faster than Toyota can make them, but conserving electricity seems to have gone the way of macrame and free love. Offices today are air-conditioned to a meat locker chill. The watt-hungry tech sector is building data centers that push local grids to the limit. I think this is maybe a Microsoft data center. And home use is skyrocketing. The Wall Street Journal recently ran an article on the supersizing of home appliances with a picture of a fridge 6 feet wide. What if we had to look at a waterless Niagara as a testament to our greed for watts? Toward the end of the interview, I asked Norm if there are people who say we should turn off the falls completely. After all, compared to burning coal, hydro is relatively benign. If we can't conserve, shouldn't we maximize power's cleanest sources? Norm and Joanne glanced at each other, and I sensed I had crossed the line into things the Power Authority didn't like to discuss. There are some people who say that, he said, but they're not serious. With the coming of the Second World War, Niagara's booming factory district went into overdrive. From 1941 to 45, Hooker, DuPont, Union Carbide, Olin Matheson, and other local industries focused on war production. They added new products to their output, dodecyl mercaptan for making rubber, hexachloroethane used in smoke screens, arsenic trichloride to make the war gas lewisite. Hooker opened the Niagara Falls Chemical Warfare Plant, and several local industries secretly contracted with the government to refine and roll uranium for the Manhattan Project. They kept this secret from everyone, even the workers who were doing it, and that's a separate chapter. Disposing of waste became an almost intractable problem. Landfills popped up everywhere. Some factories paid workers $50 a drum to take waste home with them. 3 chemical companies bought tracts of land along the Niagara River above the falls and began dumping waste along the riverbank. Fly-by-night haulers were hired to get rid of barrels as best they could. Every old-timer will tell you the same stories, local history librarian Maureen Fenney tells me at the Niagara Falls Public Library. Unmarked trucks coming in the middle of the night, dumping things in empty lots. Far from being seen as a problem, waste was a sign of prosperity. An article in the Saturday Evening Post in October 1948 described the chemical-saturated haze which settles over the city when the air is heavy at Niagara. This toxic smog, the magazine assured us, is sniffed happily by the industrially minded. Rather than trying to cut back on waste, industries sought to ramp up production. For this, they needed more power. They got their wish in 1950 when the new Diversion Treaty was signed. With the new treaty in place, Canada moved quickly to utilize its new water allowances, starting work on a new plant. In the U.S., progress stalled with a bitter public debate over who would control Niagara Power, private power companies, or Robert Moses' New York Power Authority. And I'm going to skip over a big section about Robert Moses, but the top line is, he won. And it's not surprising. He then began building the power plant that now exists at Niagara Falls and has his name. According to engineers, whoops, that's a little premature. According to engineers, once all the new power plants were up and running under the new treaty, the river above the falls would drop by 4 feet, the flow over the American Falls would shrink to next to nothing, and even the Great Horseshoe would dwindle, its flanks going completely dry at times. And you see a little bit of this starting even in this 1950s postcard, where the left side of the Horseshoe Fall here, which is the American side of the Horseshoe, is thin streams of water instead of a big unbroken curtain. There were other problems as well, ugly stretches of dewatered flats above Goat Island and riverbanks exposed by lowered water. Something had to be done. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Hydroelectric Power Commission of Ontario got to work. 2 working models of the falls were built, one by each nation, and plans were drawn up for a massive engineering project to guarantee Niagara's splendor. The remediations done by the Corps of Engineers and Ontario Hydro are still in place today. Unfortunately, this model is gone, but I just love it. The most visible is the International Control Works in the river just above the falls, a partial dam with 18 sluice gates that open and close to enable precise changes in water flow over the brink, directing more water to thinning areas and less to those that look good. People looking at this dam often think that it must have to do with power generation, but it's about nothing other than making the waterfall look better. It can even control the amount of spray, which the Canadians felt was scaring tourists away from the scenic tunnels at their Table Rock Visitor Center. So if there's a day when the spray is too heavy, they're like, turn it down on that side. The Corps also built weirs, submerged dams upstream to raise the river level above the falls and at the edges of the horseshoe so that the water would spread out to the edges and create an unbroken curtain shore to shore. They excavated 94,000 cubic yards of rock from the flanks of the horseshoe, lowering the riverbed 4 feet to encourage an unbroken crest line. While they were at it, they blasted off overhangs, sealed and graded the earth at Prospect Point to make a natural-feeling slope, and added the 280-foot-high Prospect Point observation tower. They reshaped the American riverbank with excavated earth and added 8.5 acres of land to Goat Island's eastern end, enough for a helicopter pad, parking lot, concession stand, and roadway. By the time Robert Moses cracked a bottle of champagne on his new power plant in 1961, engineers had completely rebuilt Niagara Falls, and it looked better than ever. In 1958, as these remediations were getting underway, it was reported that some local children who used the ditch near their school as a playground had been burned by mysterious substances in what was called Hooker's Dump, or Love Canal. The never-finished canal had been used for years as an unofficial landfill. Throughout the 40s and 50s, residents had seen trucks, sometimes dozens in a single day, pull up to the canal and dump mysterious barrels into the ditch. Neighborhood residents watched Army personnel with sidearms and gas masks unloading drums into the canal. Caustic gases sometimes filled the air after dumping, and at night, spontaneous explosions in the canal were common. During this time, locals continued to use Love Canal as a swimming and fishing hole, at least until the fish died and the water began to burn their skin. After the war, Hooker sold this land to the city of Niagara Falls for $1. The city built a school on it. In November of 1964, Niagara Falls Fire Chief Edwin Foster wrote a letter to the city manager. He'd seen someone using construction equipment to cover something fuming and noxious in the old Love Canal dump. Upon my arrival, he wrote, the area was permeated by the odor of chemicals and fumes emitting from a pile of chemical wastes. Foster was convinced it could be a detriment to the health and well-being of the residents. He suggested that the proper authorities be notified and remedial action be taken. The city declined to take remedial action. The state, when notified, also refused. But in 1966, more remedial action began on the waterfall. The Army Corps of Engineers reduced the flow over the American Falls by 3/4 to find ways to preserve the scenic splendor of the falls against the ravages of erosion and rock slides. They drilled core samples and inserted miniature cameras into the rock face and used sandblasting and water jets to map fractures. In 1969, what you see here, they turned the American Falls off completely to continue the work. With a cofferdam blocking the water, they installed sensors to detect rock slippage and an alarm system to alert park police to impending rock falls. They drove bolts into cracks in the rock and braced up Goat and Luna Islands with dowels, cable tendons, and drains to reduce water pressure. In 1973, as more and more residents at Love Canal were fruitlessly complaining about noxious odors and oily sludge leaking into their basements, the International Joint Commission distributed thousands of surveys to tourists asking how their viewing experiences of the falls might be enhanced. They were offering the options of having the rocky talus, these rocks you see at the left here, removed from the base of the American Falls, having the flow increased over the American Falls, or having the water raised in the Maid of the Mist pool to hide the rubble. The fourth option, chosen by only 30% of respondents, was to do nothing. Nothing is what they did at Love Canal until the situation was desperate. Pesticides, chlorobenzenes, and dioxin, among 82 identified chemicals, were leaking into nearby basements and surfacing to contaminate playgrounds. Residents developed nervous and blood disorders, and miscarriage and birth defect rates in the neighborhood rose to appalling levels. A baby was born with 2 rows of teeth. Another was born with 3 ears. Finally, in 1978, a housewife named Lois Gibbs began a door-to-door survey to prove that residents were sick and to insist the government take action. Her efforts made the plight of the neighborhood's working-class families a national issue, and the environmental justice movement was born. This is a house at Love Canal. The story of Love Canal is fairly well known, and the struggle is credited with creating Superfund, a federal program organized to clean up the nation's worst toxic messes. EPA took Love Canal off the national priorities list in 2004 and now cites it as a positive example of regulatory-driven cleanup. What isn't usually discussed is how throughout the 70s, as complaints about Love Canal reached higher and higher levels, a government that was willing to spend up to $10 million clearing away ugly rocks from the base of the falls fought tooth and nail against every dollar spent evacuating a neighborhood that was killing its residents. Love Canal was less than a mile from the Niagara River. The toxic brew was leaking into the river and going over the falls, but it couldn't be seen by the tourists. In 1979, as President Carter finally declared Love Canal a federal disaster area, the first man-made federal disaster area, and began evacuating the first of 950 families, a psychic predicted that a rock slide at Terrapin Point, the American end of the horseshoe seen here, would swamp the Maid of the Mist as it carried a boatload of deaf children. The area was closed, boreholes were drilled, and more meters were installed to give warning of imminent rock falls. 4 years later, the Corps of Engineers blasted 25,000 tons of rock and removed 60 trees from the area. Erecting a diversion dam to push water away from the American end of the horseshoe, and this is their sketch, they filled in the sporadically watered flank with made land, carefully shaping and grading it into Terrapin Point. They built an 835-foot retaining wall to keep water off the point and create a new manufactured American edge for the waterfall. Combined with 100 feet of fill on the Canadian side, these remedial works eliminated 400 feet of the Horseshoe Fall, including all of the waterfall that was in the United States. The iconic horseshoe now sits entirely in Canada. They stabilized what was left with rock bolts and re-landscaped the spot. It all happened in less than half the time it took for sick families to be moved from Love Canal. And there it is today, Terrapin Point. At the end of my visit for the spring treaty implementation, I drive out to Love Canal. I go east on Buffalo Avenue, where many of the chemical factories once stood. I pass the massive complex of the Occidental Chemical Corporation, the folks who bought Hooker. I continue east. Street numbers go up and the houses grow smaller. Eventually, I come to a huge mesa, raised in that telltale landfill form, landscaped, fenced, barbed wired, and dotted with exhaust pipes. Its fake mountain shape ominously suggests a landscape pregnant with monstrosity. How did we end up here? I think of Norm at his power plant proudly talking about turbine upgrades, and H.G. Wells rapturously describing Niagara dynamos as human will made visible. I think of my own giddy thrill at the power vista, hanging over the edge of the deck to admire the massive penstocks. Who wouldn't be awed by the prospect of harnessing such a giant organic machine? Niagara full force is a fantastic natural spectacle. Niagara turned off is another kind of spectacle, just as fantastic and just as natural, since we too are part of the natural world. Somehow, it's this in-between Niagara, the harnessed waterfall pretending to be untouched, that leads to this landscape of disaster. Because if we don't admit that the things we do to make our lifestyle possible even have a cost, how can we ever know when the price has become too high? At one end of Love Canal, the end they call Hooker 102nd Street, there's a playground at the edge of the landfill. The jungle gym is shaped like a ship and topped by an American flag. I get out of my car and walk over to it. A light rain is falling, but the flag is flying high because it's not an actual fabric flag. It's a fake flag, made of stiff plastic, so it stands there, always unfurled, always undulating in just the right way. It's pointing in the direction of the falls. Thanks a lot.
My question is what some of, maybe if you came across sort of green initiatives that the falls are taking now, if that's consideration. I know I read an article several years ago in National Geographic about how all the dams have affected the Columbia River and and the salmon out there. Not that that's, I don't know, maybe it's a biological problem as well, but just some of those green initiatives, if you came across those sort of issues.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, actually. I mean, the New York Power Authority was recently relicensed by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they had to do a lot of environmental impact studies. Particularly, one of the biggest concerns are fish mortality and fish breeding upstream and downstream of the dams. And so they've done some things to try to mitigate those problems. But in the end, it's always going to be a trade-off because Niagara produces a lot of power, and they're certainly not going to turn off the power plant. So they have to kind of balance their some of the environmental concerns against some of the power and electricity concerns, because it is a relatively benign form of power. There are also a lot of things going on to clean up the toxic landscape of Niagara Falls. The Army Corps of Engineers is cleaning up there. They have 13 radioactively contaminated sites within, the county that they're working on cleaning up. And there are a lot of Superfund sites as well. So there's a lot going on. And it was interesting to me how much of that was invisible to the tourists who came, because I find that a fascinating part of the whole story.
I grew up in the area, and there was always this rumor that that Niagara Falls would change one day. I think they said once by the year 2000. It didn't happen. Now, I don't know, it's by 2050 that it would be converted to a cascading falls due to the erosion of the crest.
Right.
And everyone in the community and in that region lamented that and said, oh my God, a cascading falls?
Right.
The Japanese tourists will stop coming.
Right.
That kind of thing. Now, is this, from what you've learned, is this a reality? Or I know you touched on that, the erosion, the bolting. I didn't know they did that.
Yeah, they did that.
Do they prevent this, or is it still a possibility that
it's
the erosion...
It's hardly eroding at all.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I've heard a meter a year.
It used to. Now it erodes far less than that. And, the water drawdowns are certainly helping that, and also a lot of the bolting and shoring up that they've done. That campaign that was originally begun by the power companies, it reemerged in the 1950s, headed up by this guy named Cliff Spieler, who was a reporter at the Niagara Gazette, which you're familiar with if you grew up in the area. And he started this whole campaign, we've got to save Niagara, we need to take out more water. And he later became the head PR guy for the New York Power Authority. So there's a kind of a long history of the power company producing this anxiety and then assuaging it with their interventions.
Yeah, and just seeing some of the slides you presented, I can see that if they really had to, there was a catastrophic crumbling, it looks like they could rebuild it if necessary.
They probably could, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, thanks.
What are some of the other waterfalls, like famous ones throughout the world, that have you been able to visit?
I would love to go, and I'm going to mispronounce it embarrassingly, but I'd love to see the Iguazu. Does anyone know how to say that? In South America? Yeah, that's far bigger than Niagara and produces a lot more power. So that would be wonderful. There are taller waterfalls than Niagara in New York State. Catterskill Falls, 100 miles north of here, is taller than Niagara, as is Tehanic Falls in Ithaca. But they're, thin, shimmering waterfalls, not big, like giant, powerful things like Niagara.
Something I've always been curious about, sort of a question about the falls and a totally different kind of power. Can you say something about how in the world did the connection between Niagara Falls and honeymoons get established?
Right. The connection that we now see in the naming of the drug Viagra, which is no mistake that it was named to rhyme with Niagara. Its force, power, The honeymoon industry arose at the same time as the tourist trade in the U.S. The Americans began to travel around in the early 1800s when canals and things like that began to be built, later railroads. And there formed this version of the European Grand Tour that was called the Northern Tour, where tourists went all around sites in Massachusetts and Canada, and it culminated at Niagara Falls. And this was right about the same time that the so-called bridal tour became a very popular thing for people to do. And so they just automatically went on what was then the most popular tourist trip. And so then that connection was kind of kept being enforced because, you know, it makes us feel like we have a unified national culture when we all do something together or when we all kind of have an experience together. And I think that's what kept people going to Niagara for their honeymoons. It's a way of kind of connecting to the American past.
So the guy was saying that, you know, to become a cascading falls by 2050 or something like that. That leads, I mean, what geologic event actually made this thing, and how long ago was it? I mean, if it could, in 50 years, become a cascading falls, is this a fairly recent thing?
You know, my geologic knowledge of the falls is not as good as it should be, because it's a part of the story that doesn't fascinate me as much as the cultural side, but I'll answer as best I can. It's a fairly recent phenomenon. I think between 25 and 50,000 years ago, the falls were formed, and they were formed 7 miles downstream at a place that's now called Lewiston on the American side and Queenston on the Canadian side, and they moved up. But what contributed to this idea is that before any of the water was diverted and before people began to change the hydrology, the falls actually did recess in a visible way. And it's partly because the layers of rocks at the top are very hard, and then there are some layers of rock underneath that are soft. And so the pounding of the water kind of wears away this cave underneath the fall, and then eventually the brink collapses. And so that kind of made it swifter than just normal erosion would wear down rock. So there are interesting drawings that you can see where they show the crest line in when they started mapping it in the early 1800s, and then up to the point where they more or less, you know, slowed almost to a halt the erosion. It moves back significantly, and there have been tragic rock falls at the place periodically.
Is it moving further toward the American side or the Canadian side?
It's, well, the international border goes right down the middle of the Niagara Strait, so it's moving towards, you know, Lake Erie, up from Lake Ontario.
Unfortunately, we want to leave enough time for you to sign books,
Okay,
if you
great.
will. So again, thank you very much for coming. That was awesome, and please, big round of applause for Ginger.
Thanks.